the war's end, New Zealand settled down to what was hoped to be the fruits of victory and continuing prosperity. In the election year of 1919, Sir Joseph Ward, leader of the Liberal Party, stumped the country, hoping to bring about the fall of the Reform Party led by Farmer Bill Massey. But it was Massey who was returned to lead the country until his death in 1925. Prohibition, so dear to the Temperance Union, was narrowly defeated by the soldiers' vote. Early in 1920, the country was prosperous. There was little sign of the industrial restiveness and economic difficulty which were soon to show themselves. Production and exports, at first, gave no cause for concern, though land prices were exorbitant, brought about by land speculation and the government's willingness to buy land for its soldier farmers. There was affluence, and the affluent and the acceptable had their social round. Gatherings and garden parties in those early years of that topsy-turvy decade, the 20s.
Private garden parties involved an enormous amount of work, getting all the flowers, looking at their very best, and praying that it wouldn't rain, because that, of course, would have ruined the whole thing. And it meant weeks of preparation and work to have your garden at the peak of perfection. And when everybody arrived, they walked around and admired the flowers and things. And as I say, everybody wore their very best clothes, but it was the older people that enjoyed them mostly. The younger ones sort of scouted about to see if there were any interesting men there. Some of the people had croquet lawns, and a lot of the older people played on those, and we often didn't play a very serious croquet. We played a thing called golf croquet, which you could play very quickly and was much easier, and people were less inclined to lose their tempers over it. Anyhow.
Croquet was hardly a majority sport. It was understandably identified with status and gracious living. The country's beaches, though, were free and available to all.
We loved the water, and we often used to have picnics down by the sea and go and swim. But as far as the average person was concerned, the swimming wasn't a very high standard. I mean, you just swam to amuse yourself. You weren't doing competitive swimming at all. And there were no bikinis or anything like that. We wore two-piece bathing gowns that went up. They were like shorts. They went right down to our knees. And then we had the top, which also had sleeves and was cut in a sort of scoop neck. And they were generally in rather dark and uninteresting colors.
Many of those who lounged on the beaches had not long moved from the country to a hoped-for greater security in town, working in new industry. The greatest development came in those industries which supplied basic needs to the growing population. While there was some movement to heavier industry, there remained the necessity to import raw materials, with the result that we couldn't compete with import prices. Allied to this urban drift was the rise in power of the trade unions and their alliance with the Labour Party, many of whose leaders had been active agitators in earlier union skirmishes.
The industrial organisation was always the backbone of the Labour Party, of course. I suppose Wellington was always a centre, but the mining areas in particular, Bob Semple, for example, was a miner. Paddy Webb was a miner. So the miners were always a source of agitation, if you like. But, of course, there were all the trade unions, and I think the arbitration system of New Zealand encouraged the development of trade unions and organisation, where in other countries that had arisen out of the work of skilled workers. In New Zealand, the system required practically all workers to be organised industrially, and that facilitated the formation of a political party. Numbers grew, they seemed to double their numbers each election until up to 1923. And then that was confined to cities or mining districts. Denniston, which was a pioneering area, many construction workers would be included in that, I think. But working underground was not so happy as working in the sunshine for most people. And there are times when people must get pretty sick of it. And under such circumstances, a very little irritation will suffice to induce them to take a break and the actual cause may only contribute a small part of the emotion.
The Labour leaders were now faced with essentially two problems. First, to win the wholehearted backing of the trade union movement, and second, to broaden the basis of their support beyond the industrial working classes, and thus to win a parliamentary majority in an electoral system which was weighted towards rural interests.
Of course, there are other people, others besides the trade unions, working on wages. People putting forward ideas that were a benefit to those who were not doing as well as they might under the present system and didn't get their fair reward. And that we sympathise with that point of view, and something ought to be done about it.
No one seemed too concerned for the Maoris, who were living largely by subsistence farming and were bewildered by the unions and employers jockeying for industrial power.
The Maori people had felt that there was a need to ally themselves, this time with a new group that they felt could help them. And an alliance, as probably a lot of people know, was formed between the Ratana Church and the Labour Party. This alliance was a natural outcome of the special character of the Ratana movement, which from the start had appealed to the dispossessed, the poor, and the uneducated. The Ratana Church was starting to fill a gradual vacuum developing with the decline of the elite of 5 or 6, mainly because there were no younger people stepping up to take their place. They were also not turning around and training the younger ones, so that the power and the decisions on behalf of the Maori people were in the hands of a few. They were not helped very much in terms of developing land. They were not on any kind of social security. The continuing difficulties with the fact that the depression was starting to hit New Zealand at that time.
The Maori farmer was among the hardest hit because he frequently lacked experience, finance, or business ability to cope with the problems of a depressed market. Prime Minister Massey, who led the Conservative Reform Party, was constantly aware of the small farmers' problems. Whereas the interests of the leader of the opposition Liberal Party, Sir Joseph Ward, lay in commercial fields.
Massey and Ward were quite extraordinarily different people. In fact, about the only thing they had in common, I think, was that they were rather massive, as you can see from their photographs. Ward was an Australian Catholic by origins from Tasmania, and I suppose Massey would have regarded him as a city slicker. Ward was mixed up in some rather dubious financial deals, shall I say, in the later part of the 19th century. Massey, on the other hand, was not only an Ulsterman and a rather strong Protestant, but he had connections with the Protestant Political Association, which was a very anti-Catholic organisation. And also, of course, he was a farmer, and I wouldn't think they saw eye to eye on very much. It's not unfair to say that Massey concentrated on helping the small farmers with extra rural credit and with attempts to exert some control over New Zealand's export industries. But it's hard to think of any very important legislation in other directions for which Massey was responsible. The big difference between politics now and then is that instead of a fairly stable two-party system, you had a very unstable three-party system. You had Reform, very rarely with a majority of seats. You had Labour and Liberal, two much smaller parties, competing to be the official opposition. So that Massey had relatively little room for movement.
Massey was a dour, unbending man who had the strength to lead his party and gather around him men of ability, particularly Gordon Coates. When the slump in export prices came in 1922, many soldier farmers and others overburdened with repayments were forced to walk off their land. But the wealthy were able to survive the inconvenience of an unfavourable market.
The period after the war, of course, was brought about at the end of the contract on the sale of their main produce to Britain in 1921. And the country found themselves going into a period where the British market was dull, was low, there was no diversification of markets, and the country went into a slump. This is in the Massey period, and Massey's first reaction after being in London, he came back by boat and he wrote his what he believed that should be the future control of the primary produce of this country by producer boards. Massey brought in the Meat Board Act in 1922 at a stage where we had one season's output of our product still in store in New Zealand. And that place was stagnated and we went into a slump. Now, what made this worse for the country was the fact that a lot of returned soldiers had come back and had been put on the land. The price of the land was reasonably cheap on the day, but the price of the product was too low for a decent standard of living. They were put on the land, and there they were really at the mercy of markets.
Farming hadn't reached any degree of specialised production. Everything still depended on family, horse and dog.
Well, never thought about it. You did it in all manpower. When we started haymaking, it was first of all the horse-driven mower, and then horse-driven rake, and then you stacked it, and again by manpower. And it was a pretty good method, and you got good hay from it. Shearing, well, in this part of the country had gone out of the clippers into the machine, and the head man came back from Australia with what they called the narrow comb. This was quite a revolution at the time. I think the landholders didn't like this particular comb. It cut the sheep, cut too low, and this fellow had his fast shears with one of these machines put away we used when the boss wasn't in the shed.
But farming conditions weren't always idyllic. Great areas of the South Island, particularly in Otago, were devastated by rabbits. They were shot and trapped and poisoned by the million. But another 30 years would pass before they ceased to be a menace. Rabbiting was a full-time occupation, and a good living could be made at it. There was always some money to be made from the land, except, it seemed, by the original owners, the Maoris. Their holdings had dwindled, though leaders like Carroll, Buck and Pomare had urged the retention of land. But the man who fought hardest for this was Sir Abirana Ngata.
It was not until the advent of Ngata that the policy to hold on to the land became a positive one. Not only holding onto the land, but also developing it. And he also found a way of getting finance for development, and finance was the most difficult thing for Maoris at that time.
Abirana Ngata became interested in the development of Maori land. Instead of Maori selling their land, he tried to encourage them to work it themselves, which he did right up to 1928. He started what is now the Maori land development schemes all over New Zealand. In the Wanganui area, they did have a lot of the lands taken over under the Stout Ngata Commission way back in about 905. And they were settling European farmers, and a lot of the country in the Wanganui area was taken under that act, so that they were leased for 50 years from about 1905. That meant, of course, that they didn't come back to the Maori owners until about 1955. The river people wouldn't have very much until Sir Abirana started development schemes around Ranana. There were several schemes there started by Sir Abirana under this 1928-29 land settlement scheme. Besides that, they always had a very big development scheme which started very early in the piece called the Murikau Farm. That's still going. It's a very profitable scheme belonging to the Wanganui people. I doubt very much whether the Maoris would have been able to hang on to their lands indefinitely if they hadn't got financial help from the government to get them to develop their land with. Without money, you can't develop land. Probably because of their isolation, they were able to hold on to a lot more of the old Maori customs, games like the string game, and Also, the ancient way of catching eels by the eel weirs, which they built on the side of the Wanganui River, pretty well from Tamaranui down. So you wouldn't find any of them now. No one worries about getting eels when they can get tin fish.
There was a unifying force emerging, founded by Tuhupotiki Wiremu Ratana. It was a church. But more than that, it sought to give the Maoris faith in their own heritage.
With Buck leaving for overseas, with Ngata getting older, they were not replaced, and there were few followers that were able to step into their shoes when they left. To the Morehu, or the survivors, as they called themselves, it seemed that the great Maori leaders lived in a world apart, a Pākehā world in which the Morehu felt self-conscious and uneasy. When such a leader spoke to them, they felt that a shadowy Pākehā was peering condescendingly over his shoulder. But Ratana movement, on the other hand, gave voice to their own unspoken thoughts.
Distrustful of the Pākehā or not, Maoris gave great welcome to the Prince of Wales. For them, he was not important as heir to the throne, but as the great-grandson of Queen Victoria. The dumpy little monarch's mystique was still powerful.
He was such a beautiful golden boy. I remember when he drove through the streets of Wellington, we all went down to see him. You know, his hair was quite golden, and he really looked enormously impressive. But actually, when you met him afterwards, he was a very shy young man, always fiddling with his tie and looking very nervous. And, of course, he shook hands with people.
As friendly and accessible as possible for a member of the British royal family in those days, Edward, Prince of Wales, was in some respects a symbol of the changing times, as were the motor cars which now thronged city streets, and the fashions which outraged the older generation.
Christchurch was really very conventional because my friend and I both had knitted dresses, and I know when we were walking along the street there were some workmen and they positively dropped their tools to stare at us. And there was one girl who'd come back from England and was looking very smart, and she was walking along the street, and a woman stopped and looked at her and said, "Painted Jezebel," because she was wearing lipstick, which was quite new. You see, New Zealand was about 10 years behind everybody else. We were just a little provincial town, and most of the women were still pretty suppressed. My father said all women are parasites, which enraged me. And I remember I was very bored with the social life, and I said I would like to have a job. And the family were most indignant because they said it wasn't right for anybody who could keep their daughters at home to allow them to go out and compete with girls who had to work to earn money. And so they absolutely flatly refused me to let me do anything because, of course, it was not considered the thing to work.
Of course, there were many girls who had to work, or insisted on their right to work. As they began to earn their own incomes, they found a measure of independence which would have been unthinkable just 20 years before. Fewer and fewer now went into those fields of employment known as domestic.
People still had their maids, dusting, answering doors and answering bells and things like that, and they still had their nannies for their children, but it was getting increasingly difficult to have them. And in the country, the thing that you had was a married couple, and you generally had the man to cook and the woman to do the housework. But anyhow, the chief idea was your parents hoped that you would marry well, someone who was respectable and distinguished and wealthy. But you see, I had this rather mixed-up life, which greatly annoyed my family, and I couldn't really face all their disapproval, so I thought I'd go down to Christchurch and do nursing, because nursing was eminently respectable. We were paid £1 a week, and we worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it wasn't terribly hard work.
Not only were the hours long, but discipline in hospitals was very strict. District nurses had greater freedom and could show greater initiative. And there was specialist training.
Well, the dental nurses were instituted in 1921, and they had a longer training than the dentists. But they were only allowed to practice on children's teeth because there was great hostility among the dentists at women intruding on their province, and it was considered very unfair. But nursing and teaching were considered quite suitable things.
The teacher was a highly respected member of the community, I think. It was very exacting work, made great demands on the versatility and organising ability of a young teacher. Of course, schools of the past, the period you're dealing with, were often referred to as sit-stilleries. The children filed in and sat in their places, and they did sit very still, and they were required to pay careful attention to the teacher and listen. Most teachers considered that the child concentration period would be in the vicinity of a quarter of an hour, and the wise teacher didn't extend the full lesson beyond that period.
We're very scared nowadays, I think, of teachers. We used to have assembly in the mornings and sang God Save the King, and after that we'd all file into the classrooms. We never wore uniforms in those days, so they weren't thought of really. Mostly frocks, bare feet, winter and summer. Of course, we used to go in all the puddles, get feet wet.
In our school, we used to consider that the sissy kids wore their socks up around their knees, and the tough guys had them dragging around their ankles. And we used to play, kick balls around and fight and tear each other's shirts about and that sort of thing. We seemed to have big classes, and I can remember the little wooden desks we squeezed ourselves into. They all had kids' names and initials carved on them, of course, and we used to be able to draw on the blackboards, and one of the most humiliating things that ever happened to me was I'd drawn a beautiful Indian on the blackboard. I knew it was good, or at least I thought it was good. The teacher came out and had a look at it, and I thought she was going to say, "That's very good, Kenny Hobman," you know. And she had a look at it and she said, "What I think should be done with this." And she grabbed this duster and started to wipe it all off. And of course I thought she was just obliterating my effort. Instead of that, she was just dulling it down. But the shame that I felt and the horror when I saw her defacing my beautiful picture stayed with me forever, that.
Perhaps children's feelings weren't paid very much attention. Certainly they were marched about a great deal, and thousands of them could be marshalled in semi-military array to grace any major public event. Royal visitors, such as the Duke and Duchess of York, may have been confused as to whether they were being shown to the children or the children being shown to them, so hedged around with formality with the functions during their tour. The doings of important visitors, shows, parades, these were the events which the newsreel cameramen of the Twenties filmed, and all seemed a little like miniatures of the real thing, the pomp and ceremonial of Great Britain, scaled down to local size. The New Zealand and South Seas International Exhibition became known as the Dunedin Exhibition. It was held, said the new Prime Minister, to commemorate the dauntless courage of our pioneer men and women, typifying the resources of our dominion and symbolizing the world's progress. It showed, he said, the Empire's capacity to become self-supporting without recourse to foreign countries.
Remember how my legs ached walking on the floors? It was fairly big, just like they have the exhibitions now. There were all sorts of things there. Everybody had stores and farmers put their produce in.
It was a very good exhibition, very good indeed. Enormous concourses of people rolled up, and we practically lived at the exhibition while it lasted.
One man who could not attend the exhibition was its most fervent promoter, arch-imperialist William Ferguson Massey. He had died in office on the 10th of May 1925, after more than 30 years in public life, 13 of them as Prime Minister. Not since the death of Richard VII had Wellington seen such a funeral procession. Massey's place was taken by Gordon Coates, the first New Zealand-born Prime Minister. His abilities were to be overshadowed by the slump, which was already hitting the country, and which would in a few years become the Great Depression. But for the moment, life in the cities was hardly miserable. New Zealand was on a theatrical circuit which included Australia and South Africa. We could see the London shows, staged for us by the firm, J.C. Williamson's, and the top variety acts brought out by Sir Ben Fuller.
By far the most popular entertainment medium 50 years ago was the Hollywood movie. Going to the pictures was a habit, a weekly escape into dreamland. Although they were silent, the movies were intensely dramatic, and they were incredibly funny, as you know from watching TV programs, and they were also often unbelievably spectacular. Ben-Hur took 3 years to make, it cost $4 million, and even today it can hold its own as one of the greatest epics ever made. Mona Loy was in Ben-Hur, not as the Virgin Mary, but in a smaller role. Her first starring appearances in silent films were as an exotic oriental dancer, an alluring wicked lady. There were dozens of silent screen cowboy stars, but Tom Action and Adventure as a soldier, a rodeo rider, a Texas Ranger, a sheriff, and a U.S. Marshal. Audiences could accept everything he did as 100% genuine.
Along with many a cowboy hero, silent movies vanished into the past near the end of the decade. Sound came in, and the cinema pit musicians went out.
The talkies weren't the only big change in entertainment during the 1920s. Music hall, for instance, was on the way out, and what there was of it had a very strong American influence. The revue, for instance, which very often followed the American style. And the conventional English light opera or musical comedy was quickly giving way to the Broadway show. Some of the most popular Broadway shows that toured here during the 1920s were The Vagabond King, The Desert Song, Rosemarie, and Rio Rita. Amateur theatricals flourished in New Zealand during the 20s. The shows were either strictly homegrown or old Edwardian successors. Why were they so popular? Because of enthusiasm, isolation, and a long tradition of small community self-entertainment.
Many a mother saw in her daughter a budding Anna Pavlova, whose visit to New Zealand in 1926 so impressed little girls that the would-be ballerinas flocked to dancing classes in their hundreds, using their pennies as a deposit on fame and fortune.
Oh, isn't it heavenly, just heaven on earth to be with you?
At fancy dress dances like this movie ball in Balclutha, it was the fashion to dress up as current film favourites. Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, Douglas Fairbanks, Tarzan the Ape Man, Mary Pickford, Greta Garbo. In those days, not all the stars were in the heavens. Some of the brightest were alive and well and living in Hollywood.
To be alive and well in New Zealand was what taxed the minds of this country's unemployed. Reputations of governments rose and fell as they sought a solution to our problems in what was becoming a worldwide depression. From 1926 onwards, our position became more and more serious. Measure and countermeasure were tried to remedy the worsening situation of a country which was producing more, but actually receiving less in return. As the 20s closed, New Zealanders showed little enthusiasm for starting the next decade, the 30s.